In Charleston, South Carolina, there exists a ledger. It sits in a climate-controlled archive, bound in cracked leather the color of dried blood, filled with names written in immaculate cursive. For over a century, historians dismissed it as a merchant's inventory, nothing more than the grim arithmetic of human commerce that characterized the antebellum South. But in 1923, a librarian named Dorothy Hayes noticed something peculiar. 47 families listed in that ledger simply ceased to exist in all subsequent records. No death certificates, no sale receipts, no trace in census documents. They vanished as completely as if they had never drawn breath. What she discovered next would haunt her for the rest of her life. This is the story of a man who appeared in Charleston in the spring of 1851, armed with considerable wealth and absolutely no past. A man who executed the most elaborate deception the city had ever seen. And then, on a moonless night in 1857, he disappeared so thoroughly that people began to wonder if he had ever truly existed at all. The only evidence he left behind were 47 empty spaces where families used to be, and a single question that no one could answer. Why? The air in Charleston on April 15, 1851, was thick with the scent of salt, jasmine, and the distant acrid tang of burning refuse. The docks teemed with life, stevedores shouting, ropes groaning, the rhythmic splash of waves against barnacled hulls. Amidst this vibrant chaos, the merchant ship Prosperity from Baltimore eased into its berth, its sails furled, its timbers creaking a sigh of relief after a week at sea. Among its passengers, disembarking with an almost imperceptible grace, was a man listed on the harbormaster's log as T. Garrett, businessman. He was not a man who drew immediate attention, yet he possessed an undeniable presence. Perhaps 40 years of age, though his face, with its high cheekbones and deep-set, intelligent eyes, seemed to defy precise aging. His dark hair, neatly combed, showed only a few strands of silver at the temples. His clothing, a well-tailored dark suit, a crisp white shirt, and a modest cravat, spoke of quality without ostentation. He carried a single sturdy leather valise, and his gaze as he surveyed the bustling port city was one of quiet observation, taking in every detail without betraying a flicker of surprise or judgment. Charleston, a city built on the ebb and flow of commerce and the rigid structure of its society, welcomed businessmen with an open, if discerning, hand. Money spoke a universal language, and Garrett, it quickly became apparent, possessed a considerable fortune. Yet what truly set him apart was not his wealth, but his profound, almost unsettling silence regarding his past. At the St. Cecilia Society, where he was introduced by a Baltimore acquaintance, the usual polite inquiries about family lineage, ancestral lands, or even a childhood home were met with an elegant deflection. "My family," he would say, his voice a low, resonant baritone, "has always been rather private. I prefer to build a future rather than dwell on the past. Wouldn't you agree?" His smile was charming, disarming, and utterly impenetrable. When pressed about his business, he offered only vague generalities. Investments, properties, opportunities that others perhaps overlook. His accent, too, was a curious blend, a hint of Virginia's gentle drawl, a touch of New England's crisp precision, and something else, indefinable, that suggested a life lived in many places. This vagueness, which in another man might have bred suspicion, only served to heighten his mystique. In a city where everyone knew everyone and lineage was currency, Thomas Garrett became an intriguing enigma. He was a man without roots, yet he moved with the confidence of one deeply entrenched. Within 3 months, he had purchased a handsome 3-story townhouse on Trad Street, its brick facade softened by climbing ivy, its interior furnished with understated elegance. He paid in cash, a detail that quickly circulated among the city's merchants and bankers, cementing his reputation as a man of substance. Within 6 months, he was a regular at dinner parties, his quiet wit and attentive listening making him a sought-after guest. By the end of his first year, Thomas Garrett was a fixture in Charleston's commercial circles. known as a shrewd, fair, and utterly private individual. And then, with a subtlety that bordered on the imperceptible, Thomas Garrett began to buy people. His first purchase occurred in November 1851, a crisp autumn day when the air finally offered a reprieve from the summer's oppressive humidity. The venue was Ryan's auction house on Chalmers Street, a cavernous building with high ceilings and a pervasive smell of sawdust, sweat, and unspoken despair. The auctioneer, Robert Chen, a man with a booming voice and a face like a weathered oak, was in the midst of presenting a family. "Next up, lot number 72, Chen announced, his gavel rapping sharply. William, a strong field hand, 35 years of age, excellent health. His wife Mary, 29, skilled domestic and seamstress. And their two daughters, Clara, 7, and Eliza, 9. A complete family, folks, a rare opportunity for a stable workforce. What am I bid?" The usual murmurs rippled through the crowd of planters, merchants, and speculators. Bids started low, then climbed steadily. Garrett, seated towards the back, observed the proceedings with an unreadable expression. He waited until the bidding began to slow, then raised his hand with a quiet, almost hesitant gesture. $1,800, he stated, his voice cutting through the din. A few heads turned. Garrett was known for his property investments, not for purchasing labor. The bidding continued, a planter from Edisto Island raising the price. Garrett matched him, then exceeded him. $2,000, Garrett declared, his voice firm now, leaving no room for doubt. A hush fell. $2,000 was a substantial sum for a family of 4, even a healthy one. It was a price that suggested either desperation or an unusual degree of interest. Robert Chen, surprised but pleased, brought down his gavel. "Sold. To the gentleman in the back, Mr. Garrett." Garrett approached the rostrum to complete the paperwork. Chen, a man who prided himself on his memory for faces and transactions, remembered the interaction vividly. "A fine purchase, Mr. Garrett," Chen said, dipping his quill into the inkwell. "They'll serve you well." Garrett nodded. "I trust they will. I have a small farm some 40 miles inland. I'll need them transported there. Can you arrange it?" "Certainly, sir. We have a wagon departing tomorrow morning. Standard rates apply." Chen scribbled on the bill of sale. "Anything else?" Garrett paused, his gaze distant. "Yes, one more thing. I would like a Bible included with their belongings, a good sturdy one. It's important they have one." Chen blinked. This was unusual. Most owners cared little for the spiritual welfare of their purchases, beyond ensuring they attended the appropriate services. "A Bible, sir? Very well. I'll see to it. Anything else?" "No, that will be all." Garrett paid in crisp banknotes, his movements precise. He signed the bill of sale with a flourish that was both elegant and unhurried. The family, William, Mary, Clara, and Eliza, were transported the following morning to a secluded farm Garrett owned in Colleton County. And then, as far as the meticulous records of Charleston were concerned, they simply ceased to exist. No subsequent sales records, no documentation of their work or production. In the vast, intricate web of commerce that tracked human beings like commodities, William and his family vanished from the ledger of public life. This single instance might have been dismissed as an anomaly. Records were lost, people died, or were simply forgotten in the vastness of the rural landscape. But it wasn't a single instance. It was the beginning of a pattern. In January 1852, Garrett purchased a couple in their 60s from an estate sale in Georgetown. In March, he acquired 3 strong brothers at an auction near the Cooper River. In June, a young mother and her infant son were bought from a private seller in the city. Always at different venues, always paying fair market price, sometimes even a premium. Always arranging private transportation to one of several properties he had quietly acquired in the rural areas surrounding Charleston. By the end of 1852, he had purchased 11 people across 6 separate transactions. By the end of 1853, that number had grown to 19. The purchases were spaced irregularly, sometimes months apart, sometimes weeks. He showed no discernible preference for age, skill, or health. He bought field workers and domestic servants, the young and the elderly, the skilled and the untrained. The only consistent pattern was that he always bought complete families, or as complete as they could be under the circumstances. When a family had been separated by previous sales, he would occasionally spend weeks, even months, tracking down the scattered members, purchasing them from different owners, often at exorbitant prices, reuniting them before sending them to his properties. This peculiar habit was noticed, occasionally commented upon as eccentric, but never investigated. After all, Thomas Garrett was spending his own money. He attended church regularly, contributed generously to local charities, and was, by all accounts, a soft-spoken, educated, and unfailingly courteous gentleman. And he was very, very careful. The first person to truly notice the anomaly, to see the faint, unsettling outline of a pattern where others saw only isolated transactions, was Lawrence Fitzgerald. Fitzgerald was a slave trader, one of the most prominent and successful in Charleston. His office, located above his bustling auction house, was a testament to his meticulous nature. Ledgers stacked neatly, bills of sale filed by date, every transaction recorded with an almost obsessive precision. He prided himself on his understanding of the market, the flow of human capital, and the subtle shifts in supply and demand. By the spring of 1854, Fitzgerald had been tracking Garrett's purchases for over 2 years. He had initially dismissed them as the whims of a wealthy eccentric, perhaps a man building a new plantation from scratch. But the numbers didn't add up. "I keep records, George," Fitzgerald confided to his business partner, George Whitfield, one evening over a decanter of sherry in his study. Whitfield, a portly banker with a perpetually worried expression, listened patiently. "Detailed records. And I've noticed that Garrett has purchased 23 individuals from various sellers in the past 3 years. But here's what's strange. He's never sold a single one, not one. Never hired them out. Never used them as collateral for loans. For a businessman, George, that makes no economic sense whatsoever." Whitfield stroked his chin. "Perhaps he's building up labor for a large project. Clearing land, constructing buildings, a new rice plantation perhaps. For 3 years, without producing anything, without any visible progress?" Fitzgerald shook his head, a frown deepening on his brow. "I've made inquiries. Discreet ones, mind you. I've asked people who live near his properties. They say the farms are quiet. Small vegetable gardens, some chickens, but nothing that would require that much labor. No cotton plantations, no tobacco fields being cleared. Nothing that would justify such an investment in human capital." "What are you suggesting, Lawrence?" Whitfield asked, a hint of unease in his voice. Fitzgerald swirled the sherry in his glass, watching the amber liquid catch the lamplight. "I'm not sure. But a man doesn't spend over $40,000 on property and another $5,000 on labor without expecting a return. Either Garrett is the worst businessman in Charleston, or he's doing something we're not seeing. Something hidden. Should we be concerned? I don't know yet," Fitzgerald admitted, his gaze fixed on the flickering flame of the gaslight. "But I intend to find out." Garrett owned 5 properties in the rural counties surrounding Charleston. On paper, they were modest farming operations. Cotton, tobacco, some vegetables. Nothing remarkable. The land deeds were properly filed. The property taxes were paid promptly. Everything appeared perfectly legitimate. But the properties had something unusual in common. They were all extraordinarily isolated. The first property, a 70-acre farm in Colleton County, sat at the end of a winding dirt road, almost swallowed by dense pine forest. The nearest neighbor was 3 miles away, a reclusive farmer who rarely ventured beyond his own fields. The second, a smaller plot in Berkeley County, backed onto impenetrable swampland, its borders marked by cypress knees and the mournful cries of unseen birds. The third occupied a narrow valley between 2 steep wooded hills, invisible from any main road, accessible only by a barely discernible track. The fourth and fifth were similarly secluded, chosen with what seemed like deliberate intent to avoid observation, to exist outside the casual gaze of the world. Garrett visited these properties regularly, usually departing Charleston in the early morning, his carriage wheels kicking up dust on the unpaved roads, and returning after dark, his face obscured by shadow. He always traveled alone, driving a modest, unadorned carriage, carrying supplies that seemed to consist mostly of sacks of grain, tools, and occasionally crates of books. When neighbors occasionally encountered him on these journeys, he was pleasant but brief, offering a polite nod or a quick, non-committal answer to any query. He never invited anyone to visit. He never discussed what work was being done or what crops were being produced. And crucially, no one from these properties ever came to town. In the rural South of the 1850s, this was highly unusual. Even on the most isolated farms, enslaved people were sometimes sent to town for supplies, or hired out for temporary work, or sold when finances demanded. But no one from Garrett's properties ever appeared at market. No one was ever hired out. No one was ever sold. It was as if the people he purchased simply stepped through a door and entered another world, a world that existed entirely outside the established order. Fitzgerald began his investigation carefully. He was looking for fraud, for deception, for some angle that would explain Garrett's bizarre purchasing pattern. What he found instead was a wall of meticulous legitimacy. Every purchase was properly documented, every bill of sale was correctly filed, every property deed was in order. Garrett's financial records, accessed through Fitzgerald's banking connections, showed a man of considerable but not unlimited wealth, managing his resources with surprising discipline. He had accounts with 3 different Charleston banks, maintained modest balances, and made regular deposits that suggested income from northern investments, railroad bonds, manufacturing stocks, real estate ventures in Philadelphia and New York. There was nothing illegal, nothing even particularly suspicious, except for the silence. Frustrated by the lack of tangible evidence, Fitzgerald hired a man named Patrick Hughes, a former overseer known for his discretion and his ability to blend into the rural landscape, to observe Garrett's properties. Hughes, a wiry man with keen eyes and a taciturn nature, spent 2 weeks camped in the woods surrounding the Colleton County farm, watching through a telescope he'd purchased specifically for the task. His report, preserved in Fitzgerald's papers, makes for strange reading. "The property is well maintained but barely worked," Hughes wrote in his cramped, precise hand. "I observed approximately 8 individuals over the course of 14 days. Men, women, children. They maintain a large vegetable garden, tend to chickens and a few pigs, perform routine repairs on buildings. But there's no intensive labor, no cotton, no tobacco, no rice. They work perhaps 4 to 5 hours per day, then retire to their cabins. In the evenings I observed lamplight in the cabins continuing very late, past midnight on several occasions. I cannot determine what they're doing. One evening I heard singing. Another evening, what sounded like children reciting in unison, like a schoolroom exercise which seems impossible given the circumstances. The most peculiar observation: Garrett arrived on the 4th day of my surveillance. He spent approximately 6 hours on the property. I observed him speaking with several of the residents at length. From my vantage point, the conversations appeared collaborative. There was no visible supervision, no overseers, no drivers. When Garrett departed, he left supplies. I could see crates being unloaded, but no one was secured or confined. At night, I saw no locks on the cabin doors, nor any guards. I must note, this may be the most poorly run operation I have ever observed. If Garrett's goal is profit, he is failing spectacularly. I have never seen such an arrangement. Fitzgerald read this report 3 times, searching for meaning in the spaces between words. Children reciting like a schoolroom exercise. Conversations that appeared collaborative. No locks. It was impossible. And yet Hughes was a reliable observer, a man whose entire career had been built on noticing details that others missed. Fitzgerald conducted similar surveillance on 2 other Garrett properties. The reports were nearly identical. Minimal work, strange hours, unusual freedom of movement, and, most baffling of all, no apparent productivity in the traditional sense. "He's hiding something," Fitzgerald told Whitfield, tapping the report. "I just can't determine what." In October 1854, Margaret Hensley hosted one of Charleston's most anticipated social events of the season, a dinner party celebrating her daughter, Caroline's engagement to a promising young lawyer. Thomas Garrett was among the invited guests, his presence now an accepted, if still slightly mysterious, part of the city's elite gatherings. Caroline, then 17 years old, would later provide the most detailed account of what happened that evening. The dinner proceeded normally through the first 4 courses. Conversation flowed easily, touching on politics, the latest shipping news, the upcoming social season, and the usual pleasantries. Garrett, as always, was a polite and attentive listener, offering thoughtful comments when prompted, but never dominating the conversation. Then, over dessert, a delicate syllabub and spiced pears, one of the guests, a prominent plantation owner named Henry Sutton, began complaining about the perennial difficulty of maintaining discipline among his workforce. Sutton, a man whose wealth was matched only by his bluster, had clearly enjoyed the wine. "They've become increasingly difficult, I tell you," Sutton declared, his face flushed. "Lazy, resistant, prone to running off at the slightest provocation. Last month, I had to sell 3 of them just to make an example. Can't have that kind of insubordination spreading, can we?" Several guests murmured agreement, nodding sagely. This was common dinner conversation among Charleston's elite, the challenges of managing their human property, discussed with the same casual tone one might use to discuss managing livestock or maintaining machinery. Thomas Garrett, who had been quietly enjoying his dessert, set down his fork with a soft clink against the porcelain plate. "May I ask you something, Mr. Sutton?" His voice was polite, almost gentle, yet it carried a subtle weight that drew the attention of the table. Sutton, momentarily surprised by the direct address, puffed out his chest slightly. "Certainly, Mr. Garrett. When you say they were lazy, what exactly do you mean? What were they failing to do?" Sutton seemed taken aback by the specificity of the question. "Failing to work properly, of course. Not meeting quotas, dragging their feet in the fields, feigning illness, the usual recalcitrants." "And the quotas?" Garrett interrupted softly, his gaze steady. "Who determined them?" "I did, of course," Sutton replied, a hint of annoyance creeping into his tone. "Based on what the land can produce, based on what is necessary for a profitable harvest." "Based on what the land can produce, or based on what you need to produce to maintain your lifestyle, Mr. Sutton?" Garrett's tone remained gentle, almost academic, but something had shifted in his eyes, a flicker of intensity that Caroline found both unnerving and captivating. "Because those are different calculations, aren't they? One is a measure of the earth's bounty, the other a measure of human desire." The table had gone quiet. The clinking of silverware, the soft rustle of silk, even the distant sounds from the street seemed to recede. Caroline, then 17 years old, remembered the tension as physically oppressive, like the heavy, humid air before a summer thunderstorm. Sutton's face darkened, his earlier joviality replaced by a simmering resentment. "I'm not sure I appreciate your implication, Mr. Garrett." "I'm not implying anything, Mr. Sutton. I am merely asking a question, seeking clarity." Garrett picked up his wineglass, examining the ruby liquid thoughtfully. "You mentioned selling 3 individuals to make an example. May I ask, were they family, related to each other or to others you still own?" "2 were brothers," Sutton admitted grudgingly. "The third was unrelated, a troublesome fellow." "And where are the brothers now, still together?" "I have no idea," Sutton scoffed. "They were sold at auction. Different buyers, I imagine. It's not my concern once the transaction is complete." Garrett nodded slowly, as if confirming something he'd already suspected, a quiet sadness entering his eyes. "So, to address your discipline problem, you separated a family and ensured that 2 brothers, who had likely never been apart in their entire lives, would never see each other again. And you're surprised that the remaining individuals on your plantation might feel less inclined to work with enthusiasm." less inclined to trust, less inclined to see their labor as anything but a burden. The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall. Sutton, speechless with indignation, merely stared at Garrett, his mouth slightly agape. Margaret Hensley, the hostess, quickly intervened, steering the conversation to a safer topic. But the moment hung in the air. A stark, uncomfortable truth laid bare. Caroline, watching Garrett, saw not a man trying to provoke, but a man genuinely seeking understanding, or perhaps making a quiet, profound statement. It was a glimpse into a mind that operated on a different plane than the society around him. A mind that saw the human cost where others saw only economic figures. Fitzgerald, hearing a second-hand account of this exchange, felt a chill. Garrett wasn't just an eccentric businessman. He was a man with a deeply held and potentially dangerous philosophy. The pattern was indeed emerging, and it was far more complex than mere financial anomaly. The dinner party incident, recounted to Fitzgerald by a scandalized but intrigued guest, solidified his resolve. Garrett was not merely an oddity. He was a man with a purpose that seemed to run counter to the very foundations of Charleston society. Fitzgerald's initial curiosity had curdled into a potent mix of suspicion and a strange, unsettling fascination. He could not shake the image of Garrett's calm, piercing gaze as he questioned Sutton's brutal logic. Fitzgerald dedicated more resources to his private investigation. He hired additional discreet observers, men who knew how to blend into the rural landscape, to watch Garrett's properties from different angles. Their reports, though less detailed than Hughes's, corroborated the earlier findings. Minimal agricultural output, well-maintained but sparsely populated cabins, and the persistent, inexplicable sounds of activity late into the night. One observer even reported seeing what appeared to be a small, makeshift schoolhouse on one of the properties, with children gathered around a table, illuminated by lamplight, their heads bent over books. This detail, more than any other, sent a shiver down Fitzgerald's spine. Education for enslaved people was not only discouraged, in many parts of the South it was illegal. Fitzgerald began to suspect that Garrett was not working alone. Such an elaborate, sustained operation, requiring constant vigilance and careful coordination, would be impossible for one man. He started looking for the subtle threads of a network. He revisited the shipping manifests for the Prosperity, the vessel that brought Garrett to Charleston. He found nothing unusual. But then he looked at the manifests for the goods Garrett regularly ordered: large quantities of flour, salted meats, cloth, tools, and notably an unusual number of books, not just Bibles but primers, histories, and even works of literature, all addressed to a series of anonymous post office boxes in rural towns near his properties. The deliveries were always handled by the same small independent freight company, Riverside Haulage, owned by a taciturn man named Silas Croft. Croft, when questioned by Fitzgerald under the guise of a potential business venture, was evasive but polite. "Mr. Garrett pays well and he pays on time," Croft grunted, his eyes darting nervously. "That's all I need to know." Fitzgerald pressed, asking about the nature of the goods, the destinations. Croft merely shrugged. "Boxes. Crates. Never asked what was inside. Not my business." But Fitzgerald noticed the subtle tremor in Croft's hands, the way his gaze avoided direct contact. Croft was hiding something. Fitzgerald also noticed a pattern in Garrett's purchases of families. He often bought individuals from different owners, sometimes months apart, only to have them disappear to the same property. This suggested a deliberate effort to reunite families that had been separated. He found one instance where Garrett had purchased a mother and her 2 young sons from a plantation near Savannah. Then, 6 months later, bought the father from a small farm outside Augusta. Both were then transported to the same isolated farm in Berkeley County. The logistics alone were staggering, requiring extensive travel and meticulous tracking. To understand the deeper currents of the city, Fitzgerald sought out Elara. Elara was a freed woman, a woman of advanced years who ran a small, impeccably clean laundry service near the market. She was known for her quiet wisdom, her sharp observations, and her uncanny ability to hear whispers that never reached the ears of the white elite. She had seen generations come and go, and her eyes held the weight of countless untold stories. Fitzgerald visited her under the pretense of needing a large order of linens cleaned. Ilara, her hands gnarled from years of work, listened patiently as he spoke, her gaze steady and knowing. "Ilara," Fitzgerald began, choosing his words carefully. "I've been observing a certain gentleman in town, a Mr. Garrett. He has peculiar habits. He buys families, but they never seem to reappear. They simply vanish into the countryside." Ilara continued to fold a crisp white sheet, her movements unhurried. "The wind carries many seeds, Mr. Fitzgerald," she said, her voice soft, like rustling leaves. "Some fall on barren ground, some on stone, and some find fertile soil, hidden from the sun." "Are you suggesting he's planting seeds?" Fitzgerald asked, leaning forward. "Of what kind?" Ilara finally met his gaze, her eyes dark and ancient. "Seeds of hope, perhaps, or seeds of discontent. Depends on where you stand, doesn't it? The world is full of paths, Mr. Fitzgerald. Some are well-trodden, visible to all. Others are hidden, known only to those who walk them in darkness." She paused, then added, "There are whispers, you see. Whispers of a man who sees not property but people. A man who mends what others break. Whispers of what exactly? Of families made whole again. Of children learning to read. Of journeys taken under the cover of night, guided by stars and silent prayers." Ilara's voice dropped to a near whisper. "But whispers are like smoke, Mr. Fitzgerald. Hard to catch, harder to hold, and dangerous to speak too loudly." Fitzgerald left Ilara's shop with more questions than answers, but a profound sense that his suspicions were well-founded. Ilara had confirmed in her own cryptic way that Garrett was part of something larger, something hidden, something that defied the laws and customs of their society. Meanwhile, Sheriff Thorne, a burly man with a walrus mustache and an unyielding sense of duty, had also begun to notice the oddities surrounding Garrett. Thorne was not a man given to abstract thought, but he understood order, and Garrett's operations seemed to exist outside of it. He had received a few complaints from rural neighbors about strange lights or unusual traffic on isolated roads, always near Garrett's properties. One sweltering afternoon, Thorne paid a visit to Fitzgerald's office. "Fitzgerald," he grunted, wiping sweat from his brow with a large handkerchief. "You're a man who knows the pulse of this city. What do you make of this Garrett fellow? He's got 5 farms out in the sticks, buys up folks like he's collecting stamps, but I never see a bale of cotton or a barrel of rice come out of those places. And his people? They vanish like ghosts." Fitzgerald feigned a casual shrug. "He's an eccentric, Sheriff. Northern money perhaps doesn't understand our ways. Building up his holdings, I suppose." Thorne narrowed his eyes. "Building what? A private kingdom of idleness?" "I've had a few reports. Nothing concrete, mind you, but enough to make a man wonder. I'm thinking of taking a ride out to that Colleton County place next week. Just a friendly visit, see what he's up to." A cold dread settled in Fitzgerald's stomach. Thorne was a man of action, not subtle investigation. If he rode out there with his deputies, the delicate operation Garrett had so meticulously constructed could unravel in an instant. Garrett, however, seemed to possess an almost supernatural awareness of impending threats. The following day, a small notice appeared in the Charleston Courier, placed by T. Garrett, Esq., announcing a grand charity bazaar and picnic to be held on the Colleton County property the very next Saturday, benefiting the local orphanage. It was an audacious move, a public invitation to the very place Thorne intended to investigate. Fitzgerald attended the bazaar, mingling with the curious townsfolk and rural families who had ventured out. He saw Garrett, impeccably dressed, greeting guests with a warm smile, overseeing games for children, and even personally serving lemonade. The property, usually so secluded, was bustling with activity. The cabins, which Hughes had reported as housing families, were now filled with stalls selling baked goods and handmade crafts, staffed by women from the local church. The schoolhouse was transformed into a puppet show stage. Sheriff Thorne was there too, looking distinctly uncomfortable amidst the festive atmosphere. He watched Garrett, his brow furrowed, clearly unable to reconcile the image of the benevolent host with his suspicions. He walked around, spoke to a few of the church ladies, but found nothing amiss. The strange lights and unusual traffic were easily explained by the preparations for the bazaar. Garrett had, with a single stroke, turned a potential investigation into a public display of philanthropy, effectively neutralizing Thorne's immediate threat. Fitzgerald watched Garrett, a profound sense of awe mixing with his apprehension. The man was not merely careful. He was brilliant, anticipating threats and turning them into opportunities. But the incident only deepened Fitzgerald's moral dilemma. He was a man of the law, a pillar of the community, and yet he was now complicit in a secret that challenged everything he stood for. The whispers Alara spoke of, the paths unseen, were becoming clearer, and Fitzgerald found himself walking a tightrope between his conscience and the rigid demands of his society. The charity bazaar was a masterstroke, but it was also a temporary reprieve. Fitzgerald knew that Sheriff Thorne, though momentarily placated, was not entirely convinced. The questions surrounding Garrett would persist, and eventually the delicate web of secrecy would fray. Fitzgerald found himself increasingly consumed by the enigma of Thomas Garrett, his nights restless, his days filled with a gnawing unease. He was no longer merely an investigator, he was a man grappling with a profound moral conflict. He decided he had to speak with Garrett directly, not as an interrogator, but as a man seeking understanding. He sent a discreet note to Garrett's Trad Street townhouse, requesting a private audience on a matter of mutual interest. Garrett's reply was prompt and cordial, inviting Fitzgerald for an evening visit. The evening was humid, the air heavy with the promise of a summer storm. Fitzgerald arrived at Garrett's townhouse, the gas lamps casting long shadows on the cobblestone street. He was ushered into Garrett's study, a room filled with books, maps, and a faint scent of pipe tobacco and old leather. Garrett rose from behind a large mahogany desk, a polite smile on his face. "Mr. Fitzgerald," Garrett said, extending a hand, "to what do I owe the pleasure?" "I confess, I am intrigued by your request for a matter of mutual interest." Fitzgerald took the offered seat, his gaze sweeping over the room, searching for clues, for any sign of the hidden life Garrett led. "Mr. Garrett," he began, his voice steady despite the tremor in his hands, "I have been observing you." Garrett's smile did not falter. "Indeed, I had rather hoped my activities were unremarkable." "They are anything but," Fitzgerald countered, leaning forward slightly. "I have observed your purchases, your properties, the unusual nature of your operations. I have heard the whispers, Mr. Garrett, and I have seen the reports." Garrett steepled his fingers, his eyes calm and unreadable. "Reports? From whom, pray tell?" "From men I employ to observe, Mr. Garrett, men who have seen children learning to read in your cabins, men who have heard singing and recitations late into the night, men who have noted the lack of locks, the absence of overseers, the minimal labor. I know you by families, Mr. Garrett, and I know they vanish." A long silence stretched between them, punctuated only by the distant rumble of thunder. Garrett finally broke it, his voice soft, almost a murmur. "And what, precisely, do you believe I am doing, Mr. Fitzgerald?" "I believe," Fitzgerald said, choosing his words with care, "that you are buying families to set them free. Not just free from bondage, but free to learn, to grow, to choose their own path. And then, I believe you are helping them disappear, to find new lives where they cannot be reclaimed." Garrett regarded him for a long moment, his expression unreadable. "A rather audacious accusation, Mr. Fitzgerald, and a dangerous one in this city. Is it true?" Fitzgerald pressed, his voice barely above a whisper. Garrett rose and walked to the window, looking out at the darkening street. Truth, Mr. Fitzgerald, is often a matter of perspective. What is freedom to one man is chaos to another. What is property to some is a soul to others. He turned back, his eyes holding a profound sadness. I have seen too much brokenness in this world, Mr. Fitzgerald. Too many families torn apart, too many spirits crushed. I believe that every human being deserves the dignity of choice, the right to self-determination, and the opportunity to build a life free from the chains of another's will. But how? Fitzgerald asked, gesturing around the room. How do you do it, and why? What drives you to risk everything? Garrett walked back to his desk, picking up a small, worn, leather-bound book. The how is a matter of careful planning, discretion, and the quiet assistance of those who believe in a different path. The why. He paused, his gaze distant. The why is a longer story, Mr. Fitzgerald, one born of personal loss and a profound conviction that some injustices cannot stand unchallenged. Let us just say I have seen the devastating cost of human indifference, and I choose to act differently. He placed the book on the desk. It was a copy of Uncle Tom's Cabin, published just a few years prior, a book that was both celebrated and reviled across the nation. You are risking everything, Fitzgerald reiterated, the weight of the words heavy in the air. Your fortune, your reputation, your very life. If you are discovered, Mr. Garrett, the consequences will be severe. I am aware of the risks, Mr. Fitzgerald, Garrett replied, his voice calm. But what is life without purpose? What is wealth if it cannot be used to mend what is broken? He looked directly at Fitzgerald. Now the question is not what I am doing, but what you will do with what you know. You are a man of influence, Mr. Fitzgerald, a man who profits from the very system I seek to circumvent. Will you expose me? Will you condemn these families to a return to their former lives or worse? Or will you choose to remain silent and allow a different kind of justice to unfold? Fitzgerald felt a profound internal struggle. His entire life, his entire fortune, was built upon the institution Garrett was undermining. To expose him would be to uphold the order he knew, to protect his own interests. To remain silent would be to become an accomplice, to betray the very principles of his society. Yet the image of William and Mary, of the children learning to read, of the families reunited flashed in his mind. The quiet dignity in Garrett's eyes. I don't know, Fitzgerald admitted, his voice hoarse. This changes everything. Indeed it does, Garrett said, a faint knowing smile touching his lips. The world is rarely as simple as we wish it to be. Sometimes the greatest acts of courage are performed in silence. As if on cue, a violent crack of thunder shook the house, and rain began to lash against the windows. The storm had broken. The following week, the tension in Charleston was palpable. Sheriff Thorne, still smarting from the charity bazaar diversion, decided to act. He had received an anonymous tip, a carefully crafted letter, likely from someone in Garrett's network, designed to mislead, about suspicious activity at Garrett's most remote property, the one nestled between the two steep hills in Berkeley County. Thorne gathered a small contingent of deputies and set out, determined to find something concrete. Fitzgerald, having heard rumors of Thorne's renewed interest, felt a cold knot of fear in his stomach. He knew the property Thorne was targeting. It was one of the most active, where several families were currently residing. He spent a torturous day in his office, unable to concentrate, imagining the worst. He considered riding out himself, warning Garrett, but knew it would be too late and would only implicate him further. Hours later, Thorne returned, his face grim, his uniform splattered with mud. He stormed into Fitzgerald's office, slamming his hat onto the desk. "Nothing," he roared, his voice thick with frustration. "Absolutely nothing." We rode for hours, through that godforsaken swamp, only to find an empty, dilapidated shack. A few chickens, a half-hearted vegetable patch. Not a soul in sight. It was a wild goose chase, Fitzgerald. Someone sent me on a fool's errand. Fitzgerald feigned surprise. An empty shack, but I thought that was one of his larger holdings. "It was a decoy, I tell you," Thorne fumed. "A clever, infuriating decoy. The main house, the one I was told was there, was nowhere to be found. Just thick woods and swamp. We searched for hours, but it was like chasing smoke." Fitzgerald offered Thorne a glass of brandy, his hand trembling slightly as he poured. Garrett, it seemed, had anticipated even this. The anonymous tip was a misdirection, leading Thorne to a property that was either genuinely empty or cleverly disguised, while the true operations continued elsewhere. The network, the careful planning, the almost supernatural foresight, it was all part of Garrett's intricate dance with danger. The incident solidified Fitzgerald's decision. He would remain silent. The moral weight was immense, but the alternative, exposing Garrett and condemning those families, was a burden he could not bear. He had seen the ledger, the cold arithmetic of human lives. He had heard the whispers of hope. And in the quiet, enigmatic figure of Thomas Garrett, he had glimpsed a different kind of justice, one that operated outside the rigid confines of law and society, guided by a profound, if dangerous, compassion. The storm had passed, but the landscape of Fitzgerald's conscience had been irrevocably altered. The year 1857 brought with it a stifling summer, even by Charleston standards. The air hung heavy and still, a prelude to the profound stillness that would soon descend upon the city. Thomas Garrett, who had arrived with such quiet mystery, departed with an even greater one. It began subtly. His usual visits to the properties became less frequent. His presence at social gatherings, already sporadic, ceased altogether. For a few weeks people assumed he was traveling, perhaps to Philadelphia or New York, as he occasionally did. But then, his mail began to pile up at the post office. His housekeeper, a stern but reliable woman named Martha, reported that he had simply not returned home one evening. His bed was unmade. A half-finished book lay open on his nightstand, and a single unlit pipe rested in an ashtray on his desk. He had vanished overnight, leaving no note, no forwarding address, no trace. Fitzgerald felt a cold dread when he heard the news. He knew this was not a simple departure. This was the culmination of Garrett's grand design. He waited a week, then two, before taking action. He discreetly sent his most trusted observer, Patrick Hughes, to check the properties. Hughes returned 2 days later, his face pale. "They're empty, Mr. Fitzgerald," he reported, his voice hushed. "All of them. The Colleton farm, the Berkeley place, the one near the hills. Not a soul. The cabins are clean swept. The vegetable gardens are harvested, the tools put away. It's like they packed up and left in an orderly fashion. No signs of struggle, no belongings left behind. Just gone." Fitzgerald felt a strange mix of relief and profound sadness. Garrett had succeeded. He had moved them all. But where? How? Sheriff Thorne, alerted by Martha's growing concern and the mounting pile of mail, eventually launched an official inquiry. He visited Garrett's townhouse, finding it unlocked and undisturbed, save for the dust motes dancing in the sunlight. He found no evidence of foul play, no signs of a hurried departure. It was as if Garrett had simply walked out the door and dissolved into the humid Charleston air. Thorne, accompanied by Fitzgerald, then visited the properties. The scene was exactly as Hughes had described: tidy, empty, eerily silent. The fields were fallow, the small livestock pens empty. There was no indication of where dozens of people and their enigmatic benefactor might have gone. Thorne, frustrated and bewildered, eventually concluded that Garrett had likely absconded due to undisclosed debts, or perhaps fled some scandal in his past, taking his peculiar workforce with him to start anew elsewhere. The official report was filed, the case closed, and Thomas Garrett became another unsolved mystery in Charleston's long history. But Fitzgerald knew better. He returned to Garrett's townhouse one last time, drawn by an inexplicable urge. He walked through the silent rooms, the scent of old books and pipe tobacco still lingering faintly. He ran his hand over the mahogany desk in the study, the very spot where Garrett had placed Uncle Tom's cabin. His fingers brushed against a subtle seam in the wood. He pressed, and a small hidden drawer sprang open. Inside, nestled amongst a few loose papers and a small tarnished silver locket, was a leather-bound ledger. It was old, its cover worn smooth, its pages filled with neat, precise cursive. Fitzgerald recognized the handwriting instantly. It was Garrett's. He opened it, his heart pounding. The ledger was not a record of financial transactions nor a list of properties. It was a meticulously kept register of names: William, Mary, Clara, Eliza. Purchased Nova, 1851. Destination, Colleton Farm. Departed, May 1857. Elias, Ruth. Purchased Jan, 1852. Destination, Berkeley Farm. Departed, June 1857. Samuel Joseph Daniel. Purchased Mar, 1852. Destination, Hillside Retreat. Departed, July 1857. Page after page, Fitzgerald read the names. 47 families. Each entry detailed the date of purchase, the original owner, the price paid, and the property they were sent to. And then, for every single family, a final entry: departed. The dates of departure spanned from May to August 1857, a systematic, organized exodus. There was no indication of their final destination, no clue as to where they had gone. Just the stark, undeniable fact of their vanishing. Fitzgerald closed the ledger, his mind reeling. This was the proof. This was the record of Garrett's extraordinary mission. He carefully placed the ledger back in its hidden compartment, knowing that its discovery by anyone else would ignite a firestorm. He took the silver locket, a small, personal memento, and left the house, locking the door behind him. The families were never seen again in Charleston. No one ever claimed to have been freed by Thomas Garrett. No new communities of former enslaved people suddenly appeared in the North or in Canada, at least none that could be definitively linked to his operations. They simply ceased to exist in the records, just as Dorothy Hayes would discover decades later. Lawrence Fitzgerald lived out his days in Charleston, a successful businessman, a pillar of the community. But he carried Garrett's secret, a silent burden that reshaped his understanding of justice and humanity. He often wondered about the families, about William and Mary, Clara and Eliza, Elias and Ruth. Had they found the freedom Garrett promised? Had they built new lives, far from the shadows of their past? Or had they, too, simply vanished into the vast, unforgiving landscape of a nation grappling with its own soul? The ledger, eventually found by Dorothy Hayes in 1923, became a historical enigma. A list of names, a record of lives bought and then erased. Thomas Garrett, the man who secretly bought families to set them free, vanished as completely as the people he sought to save. He left behind no monument, no confession, no definitive explanation. Only the haunting question echoing through the annals of history. Was he a saint, a madman, or simply a man who dared to believe that some things were worth more than their price? And did it truly happen? The silence of the past offers no easy answers, only the enduring mystery of a man who chose to disappear, taking his extraordinary truth with him.